This is our forward-looking statement slide, and today I'd like to talk to you about Ophthotech's Fovista, an anti-PDGF agent for wet AMD combination therapy. Our Phase 3 program is on track. We were pleased to announce a few weeks ago that our two Phase 3 trials of Fovista in combination with the anti-VEGF Lucentis were fully recruited, and that data is expected Q4 of next year for those trials. We will independently commercialize Fovista in the U.S., and we have an ex-U.S. partnership with Novartis. Today we'll also talk about our Phase 2b trial, a superiority trial, the largest Phase 2b ever done in wet AMD, that demonstrated a statistically significant superiority in this 449-patient randomized controlled trial, with a 62% comparative benefit from baseline over Lucentis monotherapy with no imbalances in the safety profile. We're also expanding our pipeline by looking at Fovista in other trials that we'll talk about today for treatment resistance, for fibrosis, and for treatment burden, along with our other assets, and more an anti-complement agent that will start a Phase 2/3 program for geographic atrophy later this year. We all know that there's an expanding multi-billion-dollar opportunity for wet AMD, over $7 billion in anti-VEGF sales in 2014, despite still 60% penetrance of off-label Avastin. This is a very interesting study that showed a little bit of the pharmacoeconomics of value-based medicine, where where vision for secondary to macular degeneration was compared to other systemic illnesses. And interestingly, those patients with mild visual loss in wet AMD, 20/40 vision, which, as many of you know, is good enough to have a driver's license in most states, were compared to having a minor cerebrovascular accident, a minor stroke, or angina or upon exertion. 20/40, a pretty good outcome for an AMD patient, yet when surveyed, patients felt it was comparable to a stroke or angina upon exertion. And then even with moderate vision loss of 20/80, similar to breast cancer on chemotherapy or renal disease after a transplant. So it really shows that to patients, even with a good outcome in wet AMD, they feel that there's a significant visual handicap. We all know that the initial use of the anti-VEGFs during the first year show a very nice improvement in vision in some patients. However, there still is an unmet medical need because this initial gain in vision is lost with time over multiple years, as recent studies, long-term studies, have shown. And so by 4 to 7 years, much of that initial visual gain in the first year are lost, representing a significant unmet medical need for wet AMD. Our Fovista Phase 3 program consists of 3 trials, 2 trials, as I mentioned, with Fovista and the anti-VEGF Lucentis that have completed recruitment, and a 3rd trial where we're looking at the other anti-VEGFs, Avastin and Eylea, with Fovista. Again, our initial top-line data, now that recruitment is done in the 2 Phase 3 trials, will be 4th quarter of next year. And the third Phase 3 trial of Fovista in combination with Eylea and Avastin continues to enroll patients well and is on track. Our regulatory strategy, assuming positive data, is to make Fovista available to patients as quickly as possible. So our initial thoughts are that we would file an NDA with the 2 Phase 3 Fovista trials with Lucentis that have completed recruitment. Here is our Phase 2b data. You can see it's a classic dose-response curve. Again, this was the largest wet AMD trial in the Phase 2b stage. It showed an early and sustained improvement over time with maximum divergence at the last endpoint at 6 months. We saw no imbalances in the safety profile, either in the eye or systemically, between the various groups. Now, subretinal fibrosis is the end stage of wet AMD, and it represents an urgent, unmet medical need because fibrotic scarring of the retina is observed in about a third of patients at 1 year and up to 45% of patients on monotherapy Lucentis treatment by 2 years. And I think most retinal KOLs will tell you that fibrotic scarring is the best biomarker for predicting poor visual acuity in patients. Fibrosis, when you examine a patient, looks like this, a whitish yellow scar in the center of the vision, and there's no surprise of why it's associated with poor vision, because on histopathological exam under the microscope, the rods and cones, the photoreceptors, are either completely destroyed or partially destroyed. Now, it's been known for for many years in the literature, both systemic and ophthalmic, that anti-PDGF therapy is anti-fibrotic therapy, and that PDGF is a mediator of fibrosis in multiple preclinical models of organ fibrosis and retinal scarring. And indeed, there's a peer-reviewed paper from Johns Hopkins group showing that Fovista monotherapy was anti-fibrotic in a preclinical model of retinal scarring and fibrosis. And just to show you an example, anecdotal cases of what we're talking about, on your left, baseline patients with wet AMD. On your right, a patient with developed fibrotic scar, and what we're trying to do is prevent this fibrotic scar from occurring. When we looked at our phase 2b data, we had an independent reading center look retrospectively at the data in an appropriate subgroup of patients, and we found a mean change in fibrosis in favor of less fibrosis in the Fovista combination treated group of 0.97 versus 2.0 for a nominal p-value as described by the investigator of 0.003. And we found that 27% of eyes treated with Fovista and Lucentis versus 54% of those on Lucentis monotherapy had a greater than or equal to two-step worsening of fibrosis, about a 2 times difference. When we looked at eyes with no fibrosis at baseline, we found that 10% of the Fovista and Lucentis group versus 51% of the Lucentis monotherapy alone group developed fibrosis. Again, these are retrospective analysis by an independent reading center that need confirmation in trials that we're presently running. And we also know when we look at large series of patients with anti-VEGF monotherapy treatment alone without Fovista, that the subretinal fibrosis starts to occur around 3 to 6 months, exactly the time interval where we started to see the divergence in our phase 2b Fovista data. Now, we've in the past discussed our ex-US Fovista deal with Novartis, who's been a terrific partner. The deal totals over $1 billion in upfront and potential milestone payments, including immediate payments and near-term milestones of $330 million. And a mid-30% range royalty on ex-US net sales of Fovista. Importantly, Ophthotech continues to lead our global clinical program with an anti-VEGF agnostic strategy. To us, whichever anti-VEGF you use, we believe an anti-PDGF agent is necessary, and our trials are designed to try to medically prove that. I mentioned earlier that in addition to the phase 3 trials, we're looking at Fovista expansion AMD trials in 3 areas: anti-fibrosis, reduction of treatment burden, and anti-VEGF treatment failures. Dr. Praveen Duggal and his associates have done an IST, an investigator-sponsored trial, for a 2-year trial for anti-fibrosis, where they looked at patients that had anti-VEGF treatment failures. These were eyes that had, on average, 25 previous anti-VEGF injections and either had persistent or recurrent fluid. So eyes that were doing very poorly, treatment failures. And at last follow-up at ARVO, Dr. Duggal reported that in 2 arms, 2 different treatment regimens of Fovista, a pre-treatment arm of Fovista followed by Fovista and then anti-VEGF treatment, 16.5 letter gain was seen in these treatment failure arms, and in the arm that was given sequentially, 4.4 letters. So positive visual gains, again, in these uncontrolled small IST trials. That's very exciting to us for anti-VEGF treatment failure. We're also looking at our anti-VEGF small molecule TiVo for the maintenance chronic phase of wet AMD, as well as potentially for diabetic macular edema, because we believe this has the perfect properties to allow sustained release. And as I said earlier, we will start our phase 2/3 program shortly with our anti-complement agent, Zimura. We have $426 million in cash on hand as of September 30th, 2015. And in summary, Ophthotech's Fovista is an anti-PDGF agent that is on track in our phase 3 program. Our recruitment in the 2 phase 3s that, assuming positive data, will serve for our NDA admission. The recruitment is finished, and so we expect initial top-line data Q4 of next year. And finally, we'll be having an R&D Investor Day. Anyone who is interested, we'd love to have you December 3rd in New York City. Thanks so much for your attention.